Hey there! Welcome to another video in the Items and Inventory series. Since there's been quite a few questions about this recently, I decided to make a video showing how to implement item pickup interaction in our inventory system. Enjoy! So I've prepared our scene here with a player game object that has a few simple scripts to move and look around. I also added our character script from our previous scene to this game object. There's also another game object that's going to serve as a chest that we will be able to interact with to add items to our inventory. And there's also our canvas with the character panel and the inventory itself, as well as the item tooltips. I have very good news for you guys. You don't have to worry about the setup of this scene, or anything else for that matter, because I'm finally going to make the repository of this tutorial public, which means you'll be able to access and download the entire Unity project. Let's get into what we're actually going to learn in this video, which is the implementation of the item chest script. This script is going to add an item to the player's inventory when the player is close enough and he presses a certain key. So to add items to the inventory, the two basic things we need are obviously an item and an inventory. There's many ways to get the inventory component that we want. We could, for example, just do a get component call when the player enters the collision of the item chest and get the inventory that way, or, as I did right here, we can simply have it as a serialized field and we can simply drag and drop it from the scene. The first way, with the get component call, is a little bit more dynamic, but this way is easier, so I'm gonna stick with that. Besides these two variables, we also need a way to determine if the player is in range to pick up the item in the chest, and to do that, we can use the special Unity function called ontriggerenter, and this is going to activate whenever some other collider comes in contact with the collider from the item chest. And we also need to use the counterpart to this method, which is the ontriggerExit, to determine if the other collider is no longer in contact with the item chest. We also need a way to check if the player has pressed the correct key that allows him to pick up the item in the chest. We must do that in the update method. We can do that with a simple line of code that goes if input.getKeyDown, and then giving it the key that we want to use to pick up items. Let's say we want to use the E key for that. I like to make components as configurable as possible, so instead of having the key code hard-coded here, I'm actually going to add another serialized field. Key code, item pickup, key code, and I'm going to give it the default value of E, and here I'm going to use that same variable. But pressing down the key to pick up the item isn't enough for us to give the item to the player. We actually need to check if he's in range of the chest. So to do that, let's declare a private boolean variable that we're just going to simply call isInRange. And on trigger enter, we are going to say that the player is in range of the chest. And on trigger exit, we are going to set it to false. So now, in the update method, we need to check if the player is in range and is pressing the key. Now we can finally give him the item that he wants to pick up. To do that, we can very simply just go inventory.addItem and give it the item that we have stored in the item variable. In the Unity editor, we need to select our item chest object, and we need to drag the item that we want this chest to contain into the item slot of the script. Let's just drag the chest armor, for example. And we also need to drag the player's inventory into the inventory variable of the chest. We can also change the key that is going to be used to pick up items. In this case, I want to leave it to be the E key. Because we are using the ontriggerenter methods, for this to work, we need to add another collider to our game object and set it as a trigger. So I'm going to add a sphere collider. I'm going to increase its radius to 1, and we need to activate the isTrigger checkbox. The isTrigger property, basically what it does, as we can see if we put our mouse over it in the Unity inspector, it tells the collider to be ignored by the physics engine, but it can still detect other colliders coming into contact with it, so that we can do stuff, like precisely what we are doing right now, which is detecting that the player is in range of the chest. So now let's enter play mode and see if this works as we are expecting. We should be getting a new item added to our inventory if we get close to the chest and press the E key. And there it goes. We have a new chest armor being added to our inventory every time we press the E key when we are near the chest. According to the code that we made, this is precisely what we were expecting. However, in practice, we probably don't want our chests to give us infinite items. So we need to add something that prevents it from doing that. As with pretty much everything in programming, there are several ways to do that. One simple way of doing it is checking if the item is different than null, and only adding it to the inventory if so. And as soon as we add it to the inventory, we set it to null. So basically, we are just going to be able to add the item once, and after that, the item is going to be null, and basically the chest is empty. A different way to do this, if we don't want to lose the reference to the original item that was inside the chest, is to add another boolean variable, which we can call isEmpty. And we're just going to add the item to the inventory if the chest is not empty, and as soon as we add the item to the inventory, we are gonna set isEmpty to true. So now if we go into play mode and test this again, we are only going to get one single chest armor. Let's add one more thing to this to make it more interesting. We're going to add a new game object under the item chest. It's going to be a 2D object, sprite. Let's call it item image, and we're going to set it a few units above the item chest. Let's say 1.5. Let's go into the item chest script and add another serialized field. This time it's going to be sprite renderer, and we're just going to call it sprite renderer. Let's also add a start method, and in here we are just going to assign the sprite of the sprite renderer to be the items icon, and we're gonna have the sprite renderer disabled by default. In the ontriggerenter method, we actually want to enable it, and in the ontriggerExit method, we want to disable it once again. So now, whenever the player comes in contact with the item chest, we are gonna see the sprite of the item hovering above the chest. So let's test this out. We need to drag the item image into the sprite renderer variable of the item chest, and now we can go into play mode. Holy shit! So as you could see right there, not only was the item image way too big, it was also deformed, and that was because its parent object, the item chest, was itself deformed, because we wanted it to have the shape of a chest. However, I decided to move things around to make scaling objects a bit easier. So I left the item chest parent object with a scale of 1 on all axes, and it just contains the item chest script and the sphere collider. I created a child game object for it that contains basically the visual and physical representation of it in the world, and this is the cube game object with the mesh renderer and the box collider, and this one does have a different scale on the Y and Z axis for it to look a bit more rectangular. And then the item image object stays as a child of the chest object, just as it was previously, but I scaled it on the X and Y axis to be 20%. I also gave it a little bit of transparency in the color here. And now we have our item chest looking much better. So let's test this again, hit play mode, and now whenever we get close to the chest, we see that the image is showing up. We might want to increase the radius of the chest a little bit. I'm going to increase it to 1.5. Yeah, so this feels a lot better. Now if we press the E key, we are going to add a chest to our inventory. And while we're at it, let's add another cool thing by making the item image in the chest turn gray when we pick up the item, so that we know that the chest is empty. Before we do that though, I just noticed that what we're doing in the start method, we can do it in the onValidate method. And we can also use this time to look for the inventory in the scene, if it's null. And we can also assign the sprite renderer if it's null. So to darken our image, if the item has been picked up, let's add another serialized field. This time it's going to be a color, and we're going to call it empty color. So when we add the item to the inventory and we set the chest to be empty, we are gonna go sprite renderer.color equals empty color. And in Unity, we are gonna set the empty color to be, let's say, a value of 100 on all components. So now, when we pick up the item, we can see that the item has been grayed out to indicate that the chest is empty and it no longer contains the armor that we picked up. Awesome. So we are almost done here with the implementation of our interactions. There's just two more things that I'd like to do before we go. We probably don't want other entities in our game, like enemies and NPCs, to activate the chest when they walk by. So let's add a check here in the ontriggerenter and exit functions to see if the collider that came into contact with the item chest is the player. One possible way to do this is to add another serialized field up here with a reference to the player game object, which we can then use down here and see if the game object that is attached to this collider belongs to the player. An alternative way, which is probably easier, would be to just check if the game object that has collided with us has the player tag. To do that, we can do other.gameObject.compare tag, and in here we write player between quotes. We do the same thing for the onTriggerExit method. And for this to work, we need to head over to Unity and change the player game object. Up here, where it says tag, we need to select the player tag. We need to make sure that the object that has the tag that we are checking against is the same object that has the collider that is colliding with the item chest. And we can also very easily extend this to work for 2D objects as well by using the onTriggerEnter 2D and onTriggerExit 2D methods, and essentially running the same code that we are already running in the onTriggerEnter and exit methods. But copying and pasting code is a bit ugly most of the time, so let's instead turn this into a method. I'm going to call it checkCollision. And to be able to use this in both 2D and 3D space, we cannot check against a variable of the type collider or type collider2D, because they're different. But honestly, the only thing that we really care about is the game object. So let's instead check against the game object only and replace here where it says other.gameObject to just the game object that we are going to receive as a parameter. And if we look at this, we are also receiving a boolean value that's going to be assigned to both of these variables at once. So we can actually also do this instead of having two methods. We can have a boolean called state, and we just give it to both of these variables down here. So now, in the onTriggerEnter, we can just go check collision, give it the other.gameObject, and true for the state. In the onTriggerExit method, we need to go check collision, but give it false. And basically the same thing for the onTriggerEnter 2D method, except the variable name is different. And once more in the onTriggerExit 2D. So guys, this is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.